Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 23rd chapter in the book of Joshua. This and the 24th chapter collectively comprise his two final farewell addresses of sorts. Joshua, we read, was a man who lived to be 110 years old in Judges 2:8, and the first 45 years of his life would have been spent in Egyptian bondage, so Joshua was no stranger to suffering. And then the next 40 years would have been on the wilderness and the Exodus experience. And had they listened to Joshua and Caleb's counsel, they could have entered in 2 years instead of wandering 40 years in around a desert the size of New Jersey. But they didn't, and then it was 85 years old when he entered into the Promised Land, and he was designated Moses' successor. So in between the time that he entered into the Promised Land, which Moses was forbidden to enter into, he was permitted a glance at, but that was probably for the best because Joshua was a different type of leader than Moses. Joshua was a skilled military tactician and a general, and so Moses, as a 120-year-old man, wouldn't have been an effective military leader nor even soldier for coming into and displacing the pagan inhabitants and dividing the lands accordingly. And Joshua's leadership constitutes somewhat of a golden age of Israeli unity, and there's nothing like having an enemy to unite against that can unite a people. But the land of milk and honey was sufficiently spacious for them to divide amongst the 12 tribes, and I think 3 of them even went eastward of the line of demarcation which had been promised of them. But with the exception of a man named Achan, of whose misdeeds we read of in the final half of the 7th chapter, who hoarded booty for himself at the explicit violation of the instruction of Yahweh through Joshua, and he reaped havoc on the entire community. So the lesson to be learned from that is a single sin has a ripple effect and serious ramifications which affect all those around us. But towards the tail end, having conquered and divided the land, now the first 12 chapters of Joshua describe the conquest, and the final 12 more or less describe the division of the lands. But in the 23rd and 24th, we read of his two full farewell addresses. So that being said, the opening verse of the 23rd chapter reads, "And it came to pass, a long time after Yahweh had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua was old, advanced in years." So some time had passed between the conquest and the military exploits. Israel was at peace with themselves and with their surroundings, and Joshua was close to 110 years old. Remember his biographical timeline we explained and outlined at the beginning. And what does he say? "And Joshua called for all Israel, and for their elders, and for their heads, and for their judges, and for their officers, and said to them, I am old, advanced in years." Now, a nation newly resettled with a population in excess of 1 million people would have been impossible for a single man before the invention of the microphone to address all at once. I know that Billy Graham at least preached to 1 million people in Korea thanks to modern technology, but that would have been impossible for Joshua to do. Plus, they're settled from one extremity to the other, so gathering them all at once. So these are the most important people. These are the leaders and the people who were of Joshua's generation who had assisted him in leading, and he tells them that he is old, so this could be the very last words they hear from him. "And you have seen all that Yahweh your Elohim has done to all these nations because of you, for Yahweh your Elohim is he who was fighting for you." So they did not displace the Canaanite and aboriginal inhabitants by their own might and power, but through the destiny and predestination and the strength of an omnipotent one whose strength flowed through them and made it possible for them to displace these some 7 nations which collectively formed within the nation they were to form. "See, I have divided to you by lot these nations that remain, to be an inheritance for your tribes. from the Jordan, with all the nations that I have cut off, as far as the great sea, westward. Now, the Great Sea would have been the Mediterranean Sea. This is the western extremity of the nation of Israel, and the Jordan River is at the western extremity of its territory. But Joshua was a leader, and all leaders must live and lead in the present, but they also must be mindful of the past and mindful of the future. And we gather the impression that Joshua was a man who was burdened for the future fate and destiny of his nation. And he was also rooted in the laws of Moses, of which we will soon read. He was very much guided by them and sought to enforce them by sword if necessary. And Yahweh your Elohim thrust them out before you, and shall drive them out before you, and you shall possess their land, as Yahweh your Elohim has promised you. So this is a promise to be claimed, but it didn't involve a passive acceptance of the promise and wishful thinking. They had to fight for it, and they went through at one point they were commanded to march around Jericho for some 7 days, after which time 7 times on the seventh day, during which the walls collapsed, or rather sunk. Archaeological excavation reveals that the walls of Jericho are preserved intact. So it sunk, and a lot of that is misattributed to the modern hymn, "The walls of Jericho came tumbling down." But we read in the scriptures, and it's confirmed by archaeology, that the walls sunk. But anyways, because they had followed the instructions, with the significant exception of Achan in the 7th chapter, they were able to conquer this land. And you shall be very strong to keep all that is written in the book of the Torah of Moses, so as not to turn aside from it, right or left. Now this reminds us of what he said in verse 1:7. So in 1:8, he also says that the law of Moses is a straight and narrow path, as is the way to salvation. The law itself cannot save us. It can reveal our need to be saved. But this was the revelation, the supreme form of revelation as far as the Old Covenant was concerned. But there's no wiggle room to circumvent, although certain creative Jews, as the centuries accumulated, would figure out ways to circumvent many of the commands and dictates. But if they honored it straightly and narrowly, they would be blessed with material abundance and prosperity. And if they forsook it, they would experience oppression at the hands of foreigners and ultimately be captivated by them. And this very much defined the period of Judges. Now we read in Judges 2:7 that the leaders who had lived with Joshua, Israel was preserved and flourished, and the first judge was Othniel, who was the nephew of Caleb, one of the 2 spies who advised the faithful course of counsel in response to the spying expedition. But after that time, there was a series of apostasy, oppression, repentance. They would cry out to the heavens, and they would hear them. And ultimately, several centuries later, the northern kingdom of Israel, in the year 722 BM, before Messiah, would be carried and captivated by the Assyrian Empire. And in the year 586 BM, the nation of Judah would experience the same fate at the hands of the Babylonians. So as not to go in among these nations, these who remain among you, and make no mention of the name of their mighty ones, nor swear by, nor serve them, nor bow down them. So the doctrine of separation is something which is alive and well both in the Old and New Covenants. Now the nation of Israel specifically was forbidden to have any impious exchanges with the surrounding nations. They were certainly permitted to engage in commerce in them, and proselytes from the surrounding nations were welcome into their ranks, but they were forbidden from intermarrying, not because of anything racist, because these are Semitic people, descendants of Shem, the son of Noah, as were the Jewish people, but it was more a concern with their idolatrous and religious practices, some of which were abominable in the sight of Yahweh. So idolatry is in some sense the sin which leads to every other sin, for once we detach ourselves from our infallible moral compass, all bets are off in every aspect of this, in every other place. But this is a fourfold formula for what idolatry leads. So by even making mention of the names of their mighty ones, they are also commanded to forbid and such. In Exodus 23:13, that still instills the idea, one, it empowers them, and two, it instills the idea, and eventually it gradually succumbs to acceptance of their deities and their claim. And swearing by them or serving them or worshiping them are all continuums in the same domino effect. So it all begins with making mention of the names of their mighty ones, of which there was no shortages of, and then it eventually and inevitably came to worshiping them, worshiping those they were explicitly forbidden to worship. But cling to Yahweh your Elohim, as you have done to this day. Now the word cling also appears in Genesis 2:24 when Yahweh tells Adam that a man shall cling to his wife, and it is also used in Ruth 1:14 when in reference to her clinging to her mother-in-law Naomi, but it indicates an inseparable attachment, and they are to be forever embedded and abiding in the presence and power of Elohim, Yahweh. For Yahweh has driven out before you great and strong nations. As for you, no one has stood against you to this day. So they had experienced an unending continuum of military victories and successes, with the slight asterisks of Achan's sin. But they had not done it on their own might. They had not done it on their own strength. They had not done it on their own power. They were able to do so because they remained submitted to Yahweh. One man of you put 1,000 to flight. For Yahweh your Elohim is he who is fighting for you, as he has promised you. So with the strength and presence of power of Yahweh, a single man can cause 1,000 to flee. That is no exaggeration, because there is the number or the size of the enemy or the number of the army is no obstacle whatsoever to Yahweh, as Jonathan proclaims in the son of Saul in 1 Samuel 14:6. And you shall diligently keep yourselves to love Yahweh your Elohim. Now, to love anyone is more than a flickering first impression. It requires diligence to cultivate and value and treasure and make the most of that love. So love is a command, but it cannot be coerced. He does not violate our moral agency. And commanding us to love, we can take it or leave it and live with the consequences of taking it or leaving it. But if you do not turn back at all and cling to the remnant of these nations, these that remain among you, and intermarry with them, and go into them, and they into you, so the remnant of these nations, they would remain among them. They had mostly been scattered and displaced, but a few of them remained. And if they clung to them, the word cling appears once more, as it does in verse 8. So that indicates an attachment and an attraction. And again, they're intermarrying. They were permitted to marry foreign proselytes, but not... it was on the condition that they accepted and submitted to the worship of Yahweh, and because otherwise that would invite a divided household, and their children would receive a mixed message of who is the correct deity to worship. Know for certain that Yahweh your Elohim shall no longer drive these nations out from before you, and they shall be snares and traps to you, and a whip on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land, which Yahweh your Elohim has given you. This is not a joke. It is a serious commandment and a serious condition for remaining independent, prosperous, and free from the foreign oppressors, was to keep themselves separate from them in their sins and their practices and their culture and their religion, most importantly. If they did not, they would be a nuisance, and a painful one at that, and eventually they would be they would harass them in their own land, as they did throughout the ages of judges, and then eventually they would be carried away and captivated and exiled to a foreign land and return from whence they came in bondage in Egypt, and they would find themselves in a similar state, not quite as degrading, but close to at the hands of a foreign nation. And see, this day I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in your hearts and in all your souls that not one word has failed of all the good words which Yahweh your Elohim spoke concerning you. All of it has come back to you, and not one word of them has failed. So this reminds us of in a passage in 1 Samuel where it says the word will, and also Isaiah 55:11, when the word springs forth, it will accomplish what it says. So Yahweh alone is capable of bringing his predictions to come to pass, because his word, he said, let there be light, and it was instant. But not all of his promises are immediately fulfilled, and these demand patience and endurance on our behalf. But he's assuring them of the 100% infallible and accuracy and the trustworthiness and the reliability of the words which come from Yahweh. They are not like our words. They are truth. They carry gravity, and they carry power. And it shall come to pass that as every good word has come upon you, which Yahweh your Elohim promised you, so Yahweh bring upon you every evil word, until he has destroyed you from this good land which Yahweh your Elohim has given you. So the conditions for remaining and settling in the land of milk and honey and the promised land, away from Egypt and foreign oppression, was a two-way street. There were blessings and prosperity as a condition for their obedience, and by the same token, for apostasy, they would be punished and severely. And so the covenant is a two-way street, and Joshua did not invent the covenant, or was not the one to whom it was revealed, but he made damn well sure that he was going to enforce it. And remember, he's burdened for the future of his nation, so the words of Moses were equally applicable to his own generation as all those which came after him. When you transgress the covenant of Yahweh your Elohim, which he commanded you, and shall go down and serve other mighty ones, and bow down to them, and the displeasure of Yahweh shall burn against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land which he has given you. So that's the final verse of the chapter we covered today. It ends on a negative note, but a necessary note, because the temptation would always be there, and he had to remind them of the consequences so they could anticipate the results of succumbing to idolatry. And in the 24th chapter, he repeatedly says that they affirm their commitment and loyalty to Yahweh, which in their defense they did do, because remember in Judges 2:7 we read that all of the leaders who lived with Joshua remained faithful to the covenant path, but those that came after them had lost the same spirit of obedience, and they suffered accordingly. So Joshua's warnings were immediately obeyed, but not indefinitely or permanently, and that carried grave consequences, of which he was right to warn them of. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.